June 4, 1943. Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. Unteroffizier Hermann Buscher gripped the ship's railing as he stepped down the gangplank, his legs still unsteady after 14 days crossing the Atlantic. The morning haze hung low over the docks, carrying the sound of cranes, engines, and laughter. Before him stretched something he could hardly comprehend, a place that defied 3 years of Nazi propaganda. White and black dock workers labored side by side. Women in coveralls guided cranes that towered like steel giants. Vendors sold coffee and newspapers at the gates. A brass band played swing music near a war bond rally. Buscher whispered to the man behind him, "Die Spinnen, die Amerikaner." The Americans are mad. But what he saw wasn't madness. It was America. That morning, 2,500 veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps stood in formation on American soil, the first of what would become 425,000 German prisoners held in the United States before the war's end. They had come expecting barbed wire and cruelty. Instead, they would find something far more dangerous to their beliefs, a society so confident in its strength that it treated enemies not as captives, but as men. At Norfolk, processing began with what Buscher later called the first impossibility. American officers read the Geneva Convention aloud, in fluent German. They explained prisoners' rights. They asked about diets, religion, and medical needs. Jewish American sergeants, their names unmistakably Jewish, distributed Red Cross parcels, explaining that kosher meals could be arranged for any Jewish prisoners. The Germans thought it mockery. It wasn't. Every wounded prisoner received penicillin, a miracle drug still rare in German field hospitals. The Swiss Red Cross later noted, "Medical care equals or exceeds that provided to American soldiers." An African-American medical technician drew blood from Wehrmacht officers for routine tests, an act unthinkable in the Reich, where such contact was a crime. Here, it was protocol. At their first meal, prisoners filed into a naval mess hall. American sailors sat at one end, Germans at the other, eating the same food from the same kitchen. The sailors hardly noticed their presence, more absorbed in a radio broadcast of a baseball game. That quiet normalcy, so casual, so unguarded, unsettled the prisoners more than hostility ever could. Their journey inland took 3 days. The trains were not boxcars, but passenger coaches, cushioned seats, regular stops, even windows unshuttered. At Union Station, Washington, D.C., German officers watched families embrace soldiers heading to training camps. Wives kissed husbands goodbye in public. Children waved flags. Teenagers shared milkshakes at the station cafe. On the same platform, enemies and citizens shared the air, separated only by glass, not fear. As the trains rolled west through Pennsylvania, the prisoners stared out at the glow of blast furnaces painting the night sky orange. The mills ran through the darkness, their names, Bethlehem, Glen L. Martin, proudly displayed in giant letters. No camouflage, no secrecy. One officer watched a worker toss away a half-eaten apple and reach for another. In his memoir, Buscher wrote, "He threw away food while we had fought for scraps in Africa. I realized then, we had been lied to about everything." When the trains reached Camp Hearn, Texas, the real astonishment began. Spread across 720 acres, the camp held up to 4,800 prisoners, each with a wooden barrack lit by electricity, with running water, flush toilets, and hot showers. Every man slept on a bed with a mattress, sheets, and a wool blanket. There were recreation halls, musical instruments, and libraries. Swiss Inspector Emil Sandstrom wrote, "Conditions here exceed not only the Geneva Convention, but the living standards many prisoners once knew in Germany." The camp commander, Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Stiles, spoke fluent German. In his welcome address, he explained something almost unthinkable. Prisoners would largely govern themselves. They would elect leaders, manage schedules, and run their own internal affairs. Self-rule for enemies. It seemed either madness or mercy, but it worked. The hospital at Camp Hearn was another revelation. It held X-ray machines, surgical suites, dental chairs, even a pharmacy stocked with the latest American medicines. When a young prisoner named Georg Gartner fell ill with appendicitis, he received surgery within hours, performed by an American doctor, assisted by German prisoner medics. He survived, bewildered by the care he'd received from those he'd once been told were barbarians. Then came the camp's canteen, a store where prisoners could shop. They earned wages in camp currency for voluntary labor, and they could buy cigarettes, chocolate, soap, writing paper, even musical instruments. To German soldiers raised under rationing and scarcity, the idea that an enemy could choose what to buy, could even purchase luxuries, defied reason. By autumn 1943, the labor shortage in Texas brought the next surprise. Prisoners were offered paid work in agriculture and local industries. They earned 80 cents per day, the same base rate as an American private. At the King Ranch, near Kingsville, they worked the land alongside Mexican-American vaqueros and black ranch hands, a sight that clashed with every Nazi notion of racial order. The ranch, nearly the size of Rhode Island, used machinery the prisoners had never seen. Harvesters that replaced dozens of men, and even airplanes to survey herds. One ranch foreman treated them as temporary employees, not captives. To men trained in obedience and hierarchy, this equality was more disorienting than captivity itself. At cotton mills across Texas, the astonishment deepened. At the Hearn Cotton Oil Mill, the prisoners watched machines process in one day what German factories might handle in a month. Workers listened to radios, took breaks, and argued freely with supervisors, all while output soared. The Germans could not understand it. In their world, efficiency came from fear. Here, it came from freedom. They began to see what their commanders never had. That discipline without fear was possible, and far more powerful. At a nearby farm, a Texas farmer shouted at a government inspector over crop quotas, told him to go to hell, and walked away untouched. To the prisoners, it was astonishing. In Germany, such defiance would have meant arrest. Here, it was just Tuesday. Evenings brought new shocks. Local churches invited prisoners to attend Sunday services. Baptist, Methodist, and Catholic congregations welcomed them as guests. On Christmas Eve, 1943, the people of Hearn, a town of barely 2,000, organized gifts for every German prisoner. Churches and schools gathered donations, candy, cards, handmade decorations. The local American Legion, veterans who had fought Germans in the last war, sent sports equipment and cigarettes. The town erected a 30-foot Christmas tree in the camp courtyard, strung with electric lights that burned through the night. More electricity, records show, than many German villages used in a week. The Methodist church choir learned Stille Nacht phonetically and sang it for the prisoners. One guard reported seeing grown men in uniform quietly crying in the cold Texas night. The dinner that followed defied belief. Roast turkey, ham, sweet potatoes, pies, ice cream, even beer for enlisted men, and wine for officers. Each prisoner consumed more in one meal than his family in Germany might see in a week. And when the evening ended, no propaganda was necessary. The lesson had already been learned. The contradictions of America, its kindness, its inequalities, haunted the prisoners in equal measure. At Camp Hearn, black soldiers from the 359th Infantry Regiment occasionally served guard duty. The Germans, steeped in racial dogma, were forced to take orders from men they had been taught were inferior. Some demanded transfers. Their requests were ignored. But irony cut both ways. Those same German prisoners could eat in restaurants that refused service to their black guards. They could sit in movie theaters where those guards had to use the balcony. To the prisoners, this hypocrisy, a nation both progressive and prejudiced, was bewildering. Yet it also revealed something they had never seen before: a system capable of self-criticism, a society struggling with its flaws rather than denying them. On the farms of Texas, they worked side by side with Black and Mexican-American laborers who outperformed them. Productivity here came not from race, but from respect. Slowly, even the proudest Nazis began to understand. Their hierarchy was a lie. One of them, Hermann Bucer, later wrote in his memoir, "These people whose sons we had tried to kill gave us gifts. Their kindness was not weakness, but strength. The confidence of victors who knew they had already won, not just the war, but the peace to come." After the war, Bucer immigrated to the United States, became a citizen, and worked as an engineer in Detroit until he retired. Others followed similar paths. Georg Gertner, the same man whose life had been saved by American doctors, escaped from a camp in New Mexico, and chose not to flee the country, but to stay. He lived under an assumed name, married an American woman, raised a family, and when he finally surrendered in 1985, he had lived as an American longer than he had as a German. And Reinhold Pabel, who escaped from Illinois, spent years working quietly in Chicago bookstores before turning himself in and becoming a citizen. Each of them had arrived as enemies and stayed as believers. Across America, more than 500 prisoner-of-war camps held men like them, each a small, contained world where Germany met the United States face to face. At Camp Alva, Oklahoma, prisoners farmed 200 acres of land using American techniques: crop rotation, soil conservation, hybrid seeds. The Department of Agriculture later reported that many of those men returned to post-war Germany and rebuilt its farms using what they had learned in captivity. In Concordia, Kansas, German artists painted murals that still adorn courthouse walls. Their orchestra performed concerts for civilians. The local newspaper called them as fine as any professional ensemble. In Trinidad, Colorado, where the winter winds cut like knives, the Army provided Arctic-grade clothing and 4,000 calories a day to keep men warm. Swiss inspectors noted that the prisoners were better fed and housed than many German soldiers still fighting on the Eastern Front. The surprise was not only comfort, but transparency. Inside these camps, prisoners read American newspapers, the New York Times, Chicago Tribune, even local weeklies, filled with political debate, criticism of the war effort, and arguments over policy. They listened to radio programs where comedians mocked generals and senators. They watched democracy in action, loud, divided, imperfect, and yet still working. When the 1944 presidential election arrived, they saw the unthinkable: a nation at war freely questioning its own leader. Newspapers printed attacks on President Roosevelt. Opposition speeches were broadcast uncensored. And still, the government functioned, the war continued, and the people remained united. To men raised under a regime where doubt was treason, this chaos looked like freedom itself. Neutral observers confirmed what those prisoners felt. The International Red Cross, after dozens of inspections, declared American POW camps to be the best in the world. The findings spoke plainly. Caloric intake, 3,300 to 3,800 calories a day. Living space, 40 square feet per man, nearly double treaty requirements. Medical care, 1 doctor for every 500 prisoners. Recreation, sports, libraries, classes, music, exceeding standards of most military training facilities. The inspectors concluded, Americans treat their prisoners as temporarily displaced persons, not as enemies. In the fields and factories, that philosophy proved more powerful than propaganda. At the Lone Star Steel plant in Dangerfield, Texas, German engineers watched American workers compete for bonuses, suggest improvements, and celebrate production records like baseball scores. They painted bomber names on steel shipments and bought war bonds with overtime pay. Productivity came not from fear, but pride. At railroad yards, prisoners saw how the nation moved. Trains arriving on the minute. Freight rolling coast to coast through a web of telegraph and telephone lines. All coordinated not by command, but by cooperation. To men trained to obey, it looked like organized anarchy, and yet it worked better than any order they had ever known. By the spring of 1945, the war was ending, and the Americans were preparing their prisoners for what would come next. Education programs expanded. Tens of thousands studied English, agriculture, engineering, and public administration. Professors visited the camps to teach democracy, not as theory, but as practice. In some classes, officials quietly explained plans for Germany's reconstruction, the future Marshall Plan, still secret then. They told the prisoners that America would rebuild, not punish. That message, mercy instead of revenge, struck deeper than any weapon. For men who had been taught that weakness was fatal, generosity was the final defeat. The results were measurable. Of 425,000 German POWs held in the United States, fewer than 2,300 escape attempts were recorded, barely half of 1%. Only 54 succeeded in staying free more than a month. Sabotage, 7 cases. Work refusals, 178. Voluntary labor participation, 87%. When they went home, they carried something more durable than memories. Surveys by occupation authorities found that 3/4 returned with favorable views of democracy. More than half supported a future alliance with the United States. Thousands wrote to American families for decades afterward. By the 1950s, over 5,000 former prisoners had immigrated to the U.S., most becoming citizens within a few years. Their success rates, jobs, homes, clean records, exceeded nearly every other immigrant group. Many helped rebuild West Germany. Dozens entered politics. 48 became Bundestag members. Hundreds became mayors and teachers. Thousands managed farms and industries shaped by what they had seen behind American fences. One of them, Hans-Georg von Studnitz, later said, "We returned from America with more than memories. We brought knowledge of how democracy functions, how freedom organizes itself. We had seen the future, and we knew it worked." Camp Hearn closed in December 1945. But the story did not end there. For decades, letters arrived from former prisoners. Christmas cards, photographs, messages of thanks. In 1984, 40 years after D-Day, 50 of them returned to Texas. They stood again beneath the southern sky, now as old men, and embraced the guards who had once watched them. Together they placed flowers at the American Legion Memorial. One of them, Fritz Zimmermann, spoke for the group. "We came as enemies, believing in destiny and race. We left as friends, understanding that democracy's strength lies in its chaos, and that freedom's greatest weapon is its humanity." Historians would later call it the most successful re-education in history, not through lectures or slogans, but through lived experience. The German prisoners who came expecting hatred found mercy. They came expecting weakness and found strength. They came as soldiers of tyranny and left as witnesses to freedom. In the end, America's greatest victory was not won on the battlefields of Europe, but in the quiet fields of Texas, where enemies learned, by simple exposure to liberty, that compassion can conquer ideology. Those who saw it never forgot. Because the sights that stunned them, women driving trucks, children free to speak, workers defying bosses, strangers showing kindness, were not acts of propaganda. They were simply life in a free country. And for those men, that sight alone was enough to change everything.